Stefan is an environmental health technical specialist at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection, and has served the state of Wisconsin for 10 years. His current duties include review of extended run process variances, HACCP plans, and facility plans for food manufacturing facilities to be in compliance with state of Wisconsin regulations and development of informational and educational materials related to division programs and activities. He delivers both general and specific food safety training for Wisconsin DATCP staff and the industry. Stefan holds a registered sanitation credential through the National Environmental Health Association. Prior to his current role with the state of Wisconsin, he was a state inspector of retail food establishments and recreational facilities for 7 years. He has also worked in industry as a supervisor in a facility producing products such as meat. In research and development of food production and in various retail food environments. Stefan graduated from UW Eau Claire with his BS in Environmental Public Health. And I would just like to say Stefan has been a great help in communicating with our association, helping us understand changing rules and listening to our input and applying them towards those rules and kind of helping us get things going. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Stefan.
Thanks, Steve. Get my Zoom chat put back where it was. It got taken away from me. So let me see if I can't get that back here. All right, we'll call that good enough. I'm going to try to watch for questions as they come in so that I can go off on a tangent if we have time. I think I'm starting just a little bit early, so I'll give you the brief of it. And if you have questions, you want to hear any stories that I have about something or some more specifics, I'll do my best to provide that. Looks like I am sharing the PowerPoint screen. So as Steve said, I've been with the department for about 10 years, and it's been a bit varied as to what I do cover. Sometimes it's very general, something about your label. Do I have to have it this way? Can I do it this way? It can get very detailed as well. It might come down to, we usually don't like to pick over font size, but the state and federal regulations, some are very, very general. Most of them are flexible, which is usually good for both of us. And some of them are very, very precise. You have to have a very specific temperature, and it can be difficult to navigate those as well. So if we have any time at the end, I'll try to share my browser window to show you how to use the legislature's website and search the federal regulations a little bit as well. If you want to see directly, where does it say that? What exactly does it say? I'll try to go over that. I think at one point it used to be our mission statement. I don't know that it's our goal exactly, but safe food, as has been said by many others, is what our goal is. And a fair marketplace as well. A lot of that has to do with labeling, honest and labeling. And we're going to hear a little bit more about labeling, I think, after my presentation from FDA. So we want to make sure that the food is safe and that businesses of all sizes have a fair shot at this marketplace. So to start, I'll talk a little bit about licensing. So when it's required in a bit more detail and when it might not be. That is, there are different requirements for facilities that are solely concentrating maple sap, if that's essentially your only activity, or if you have areas that that's all you're doing that in. To verify these requirements are met, you might receive inspections, you likely will eventually, from both the state of Wisconsin and FDA. So I'll provide you some time for questions and answers at the end. But again, please raise your hand through Zoom or type in the chat. There's a Q&A function as well that I'm not entirely familiar with. See if I can check on that. About a food safety plan, which I'll get to, I think, in the records section. So let me move this around so that I can keep that up. I guess the Q&A is different than the chat. I learn something every time I do Zoom. I've only used it a couple of times. I usually consider myself fairly tech savvy. Okay. There we go. So with regard to licensing, we want to start with a few questions. What is your finished product? What is it that you're actually making? So if you're only collecting maple sap and not concentrating it or processing it, then our department does not require a food processing plant license or really any sort of food license. If you're producing and packing only maple syrup or concentrated maple sap for sale directly to consumers or to a licensed food processing plant, then your facility might be exempt. If you are producing an acidified canned food, and that's a very specific classification of food, then you might be exempt from holding a food processing plant license under Wisconsin's pickle bill. This is, some would call it a cottage law or a craft producer exemption. If you're making liquid maple products other than maple syrup that meets the standard of identity, so nothing with added flavors in it, then you might have a product that is water activity controlled. Maybe it's acidified. Maybe it needs to be refrigerated or acidified for safety or controlled in some other way for food safety. The next question to ask about licensing is how much are you selling? It's been covered in at least one or two presentations. I think in Christine's in a bit more detail about the $5,000 threshold. So basically in any 12-month period, if that is the limit of your sales, then you might be exempt from holding a food processing plant license, subject to registration for your production of maple syrup. The pickle bill also has that threshold. So if you're not just making maple syrup, say you're making canned vegetables and you're acidifying them, you may want to look into our statute, Wisconsin statute, to see if you qualify for one or both of those exemptions. Where are you selling it from? So you're likely going to be required to hold a warehouse license if you're storing your product off-site. We don't issue a separate warehouse license typically when you're warehousing your product in the same building that you're processing it. But if you say are going to send somewhere else to store for more than 24 hours, say off-site, and that's all you're doing at that facility, well, you are doing some sort of food activity you're storing. So there are some food safety concerns there, but it's going to be, the fees are going to be less and it's going to be a bit quicker of inspection. The requirements are a bit simpler. Now, if you sell maple syrup and certain other products, I think sorghum and there's some other foods, maybe cider listed in statute, to retail consumers on your farm, and those are the majority of your food sales, there is no dollar limit on that for a certain statutory exemption. So there are lots of different exemptions. If you think you're going to fall into one, make sure you know which exemption or exemptions you are claiming and that you can support that as best as possible. And the final nuance here is to whom are you selling it? So again, if you're only selling concentrated maple sap to other processors, then you might want to consider whether or not you meet all the criteria for that $5,000 per year exemption, which comes from Statute 97. I'll show you how to find that in a little bit. and also work with registering with our department. And the link, I believe, is on our website, as well as maybe indirectly from wismaple.org, maybe Anderson's as well. The registration form, I am working to get updated. So you might see some things on there that look a little odd. So our forms are continually being updated, not as quickly as we'd like, but do watch out for that. Make sure that you're using the most current form available. So here's our website for more information. Basically, just type in the alphabet soup acronym .wi.gov, datcap.wi.gov. So to start the licensing process, you're going to want to contact our staff at the email address. If you call, the calls will get answered by a machine. It's the only way we can get to all of them, and it's going to be converted to an email. Since all of you are on the Zoom call, I gather some level of computer technology is all right. But you will be sent a lot of information that can be overwhelming. So do your best to read through it completely so that you know exactly what questions we're going to ask and what's expected of you. Once our department receives a completed license application, you can expect to get a phone call within 30 days from your inspector to schedule a licensing inspection. If your facility passes inspection, your license is valid that day, and only after then are you allowed to start processing. It's fairly rare that a license is not issued at the end of an inspection, sometimes called a pre-licensing inspection, or rather a licensing inspection. But in the event that there are significant violations that our staff find, we will be clear about what has to be corrected before a license is issued. Also be sure to contact your local town, the village, county, city government to find out if there are any local ordinances you need to meet to process or sell your maple syrup as well. Farmers markets may have their own rules too, so be aware of that. There are some subtle differences. I'm going to answer a licensing question, I think, before we get to this next one. The question is, if someone is a new producer, can they get licensed with their food safety plan without the forms actually filled out as the season has not started? Food safety plan is something very specific. When we hear that, we think of more the federal rules. There's a recall plan that we require for all licensed food processing plants. We would require an application and a license before getting started if you're not otherwise exempt. So we have a template for recall plan if that's what's being mentioned. A food safety plan is required depending on if a facility is qualified or not to federal standards, meaning generally the size of the business. Basically, you want to have certain controls and written procedures in place to meet some federal requirements. But if you're just getting started, it's perhaps unlikely, unless you're very large, that is the case. So when you do get licensed, you will get a bunch of resources for developing a recall plan. And that's only part of the food safety element of it. So I'm not sure I understand the entire question, but if you want to provide more details, I'll provide my contact information at the end, and hopefully I can answer it later or at the end of this session. Another question about what is required for a maple syrup producer that sells less than 5,000 per year and only sells direct to the buyer. So the selling to other processors up to 5,000, that's requiring registration, and that's to be exempt from holding a food processing plant license. That rule, our administrative rule that covers that license was updated, and I believe it's now called, I'll have to double check here, wholesale food manufacturing, I think they're calling it now, but it's still a food processing plant license essentially. I can find my cursor here. Sometimes these windows stick over the top, which is helpful, or not. Yeah, wholesale food manufacturing is the name of the new rule, ATCP 70. So if you're not required to hold a food processing plant license under that rule anyways, then you don't need to file a registration. And again, as I said, for certain retail sales. So if you're selling your maple syrup from your farm direct to the consumers or the people that are buying it, not for them to resell, but for them to have themselves, then there isn't a registration required. I would recommend keeping records, although it's not required, just in case anything comes up. You need to see how it changes year to year. So clarifying selling individuals, not wholesale or bulk. Correct. Bulk being wholesale. I could pull up the actual statute, but essentially it's retail sales, whether it's gallon containers, quart, pint. It's more that you're selling like a grocery store would sell to consumers. You know, some people who are food manufacturers would use a large grocery store as their food supplier. So in a sense, they're technically wholesaling. But if you're not wholesaling, or you're not selling with the intent of wholesaling, you're just selling someone 2 gallons, a pint, whatever it is at retail, there aren't any specifics or really limits around amounts. But if the intent is retail sale and it's your maple syrup from your farm, there isn't a limit on that if those are the majority of your food sales. Good question. I got another question about inspections during our pandemic, and then I will get to that towards the end when I talk about inspections a bit more. So to keep it moving back to the topic, when we're talking about facilities used solely for concentration of maple sap, when I say facilities in this context, it could be everything you have covered by your license. It might be a building, or it might be one or more rooms or areas dedicated only for maple sap concentration. So facilities where you're doing other activities such as prepackaging or bottling maple syrup intended to be sold at retail directly to the consumer, that must meet the full requirements for all food processing plants. And those requirements are found in our state administrative rule, ATCP 70 for Ag Trade Consumer Protection. But if it's only for concentration, then there are alternative standards in 87, as well as the grading standards in 87. So this doesn't mean you shouldn't strive to design and maintain your facility to the highest standards, but we understand you do have to prioritize things. Not everything can be perfect all the time right away. So shown on the slide here are 4 code sections where this used solely language shows up. Current copies of the state rules and statutes may be found on our state legislature's website. And I'm going to try to type in the chat, because for whatever reason, I didn't put it on the slide here. The state legislature website gets to be in the mouthful after enough time. legis.wi.gov. If we have time at the end, I'll go through there to show you how to navigate that to find it. I mean, you can do an online search as well, but sometimes you get a secondary website that links you to an old version. And I want to make sure that you folks have the current version of everything that you're looking at. All right, on to the next topic. Getting a bit more into what's actually required in these rules. Before we enter your concentration building during an inspection, we are going to be evaluating the surrounding area for standing water and any other potential health nuisance. So to be clear, we do expect there to be mud when the sap is flowing, but it shouldn't be entering the processing building on your boots. And the grading around your building should keep the standing water away from the structure. I was at a facility 2 seasons ago that had about 10 feet of ice and water and stuff to walk across before getting into the building. And then when I got in there, there was a cracked slab and a few inches of water on top of that. Not a good deal. So that would not meet our expectations. Some other examples of potential health nuisance could be leaking gas cans, wood piles up against the building that critters are making a cozy home out of, or spare items that aren't in use like buckets that given enough time, they're going to hold water and they're going to go green and all funky with algae. So you are allowed to keep 1 day's worth of firewood or other fuel indoors, but the remainder of your firewood or fuel has got to be kept outside at a distance that's not going to attract pests into your building. We don't have a specific distance and rule for that. You know, if you look at various pest control guidelines. You might see 30 feet, you might see 100 feet. It just depends on what else is around there. You know, if you do some pest control monitoring, you should be able to control it by just keeping an adequate distance. The floors of your operation must be smooth, cleanable, and durable where you're just concentrating. So gravel floors are not going to be allowed because they're not smooth or cleanable. And if you wash it through with a hose to the ground underneath, that doesn't count. If you've got pitting and cracks in your floors, those need to be patched and sealed up. Ideally, you'd have coving between the floors and walls, like in your bottling areas. But if not, this is not a violation in your areas that you're just solely concentrating in. The idea is to make cleaning easier, and to that end, the more you can make the walls and ceiling a light color, the better. You are only required to have 10-foot candles of light where you're concentrating. So that's the lowest standard of lighting in any area, basically. And so for reference, that's about what I measure on top of the desk in my office. And I've got 3 60-watt equivalent bulbs overhead and a north-facing window, and that was on a cloudy day. So I certainly wouldn't want any less for cleaning, and especially if you're using a paper color checker instead of a spectrophotometer, you're going to need a bright neutral light to evaluate your color. And you can measure this lighting intensity yourself with most smartphones and free apps. So the value that I tested to get about 10-foot candles, it was pretty rough measure, you know. And so when we're out there in the field, you know, we're not bringing a $1,000 light meter out there and picking on that. If it's too dark to see if it's even dirty or not, that's too dark. You know, that's when we might say, okay, let's get some more lighting in here. And if you're looking for a certain standard, there is one. It's 10-foot candles. A couple more questions. Laws applying if you're selling part of your syrup in bulk and half at home, and that would depend on the ratio that you are selling at, possibly. So if you're selling retail at home, there isn't a sales limit for exemption of just maple syrup from if your home is your farm, essentially. And if you're selling over the $5,000 threshold, then you would be required most likely to have a food processing plant license. So ATCP 70 is going to be the rule that applies in that situation. There are a lot of different factors, so contacting our licensing specialists will help sort through all the different factors. You know, perhaps maybe other foods that you might be producing and selling, but just selling part of your bulk syrup in bulk and half at home. Yeah, I'm thinking food processing plant license. I would have to double check because the rule change that became effective February of last year, it used to be kind of a 51-49 proposition between the food processing plant license and a retail license. But now I think the threshold is more of a 25% on one side, but you still have the possibility of an exemption in place. So, so not a final answer, but I'm going to go food processing plant license on this one. Similar question is, do you need a license to sell bulk syrup to a buyer for further processing as an ingredient in another product? Yes, there's no, I mean, the $5,000 exemption may still apply, but regardless of what someone else is doing with it downstream, because you know, you probably should know what someone's going to do with it if they're buying it from you. You don't necessarily have to, but certainly beyond that, more than 1 degree of separation, you're not required, and it's not reasonable for you to keep tabs on exactly what's going on with your product. Nice to know if you can, but more important that you are aware of the safety of your ingredients upstream. And with maple syrup, you're getting it straight from the source, basically from your sap, usually from your trees or from one other location or business. So good question. Keep it going here, try to watch the time. Whoop, get ahead of myself. So moving up to the walls and ceiling, we touched on a little bit, but white fiberglass plastic, FRP, reinforced plastic, milk board, sometimes I hear it called, pretty common in the food industry. This might be a suitable material in terms of durability and cleanability. We understand it isn't economical for all situations. You know, I had a facility and they said, well, do I have to go floor to ceiling stainless? I thought, well, that'd be pretty nice, but very expensive. Places where you have deep fat fryers and flour, say you're breading appetizers, that gets really messy. You're going to need to really scrub hard, and stainless is going to hold up to that. But maple syrup is a different thing. So if you decide to paint a wall or ceiling, maybe you have a bare studded wall or bare studded ceiling, first be sure that the paint is formulated to withstand high levels of moisture and temperature swings. We often hear raw wood as a cited violation, or wood that's not finished off or made not absorbent. But the last thing you want to do is climb up on a ladder and scrape off loose flaking paint from the ceiling after a few years. So if you're able to keep your walls and ceiling visibly clean without wet washing, then you're technically not going to need to make them impervious to moisture like you are in your bottling room. Again, this is just for areas solely for concentration. So your walls and ceiling do have to be tightly sealed against the outdoors, meaning no leaky roof, of course, but also tight enough that you aren't getting any birds or insects in there. Now, insects aren't a problem when the sap is flowing, but they most certainly can be in the off season, which can make cleaning more of a hassle the next time you do clean. Our expectation is that you keep insects and other pests out at all times, whether that is with some mesh screening for when the windows are open, or weather stripping on your doors. The doors to the outside from your concentration room do not need to be self-closing, but you are required to keep them closed when you're not using them. Basically walking through the doorway or loading in or loading out something. Keeping the doors closed should not be causing ventilation issues either. You have to have enough ventilation that condensation does not form on surfaces other than in your evaporator where it's supposed to. So again, go ahead and crack a window if you need to, but keep it screened. By contrast, in your other areas, such as your bottling room or building or area, a MERV 7 or better air filter is required for your intake air. So a bug screen is going to cut it there. And the requirement for an air filter, the MERV 7 is essentially an equivalent. It says greater than MERV 6, I believe, in our rule, which is a slight change. So when you're looking at 70, that's essentially what it says. There's some ideal things, and that's one of the more better practice things and specific rules that's now required. Toilets may be a bit different where you're concentrating. So there isn't a maximum distance from the concentration area required in our code for toilets. Rather, it's convenient access is what our general requirement is. So the portable toilet might be something to consider, but understand there are going to be DNR regulations that become more relevant if you don't have a conventionally plumbed toilet where you're concentrating. So you've got to have at least one hand washing sink to go along with that, conveniently located for your toilet and to your processing areas. And again, ideally, you'd have at least one hand washing sink for each. But in any case, you've got to have water under pressure, soap in a dispenser, if not paper towels, then some other single service means of drying your hands, not a cloth towel reused over and over, and a covered trash bin. The water has to be under pressure, but need not come from a pressure tank. Let me say that again. The water under pressure need not come from a pressure tank. So it could be gravity fed, for example. We see this in a lot of plain sect communities, Amish Mennonite, for example, and even other areas where, okay, so I could hook up a battery on a pump, but why do that when I just have a vertical tank, with plenty of vertical head pushing down. Now, since both hot and cold water are required for any 2 or 3 compartment sink, to wash and rinse, sanitize your small equipment and utensils. If you have the same water supply serving both these utensilware washing sinks and your hand washing sinks, then you might as well have hot and cold water at your hand washing sinks as well. I mean, you're probably not going to be washing your hands very well. I wouldn't if it was ice cold. I'll just say that. And while we're talking about sinks, there is still the potential to apply for a variance with our department when you're unable to meet a requirement the way is written in rule, but have a way that provides an equal or better way to maintain some food safety. So for example, You might not have a hand washing sink, but you have a 5-gallon supply container with a valve that stays open, and you've got a 5-gallon bucket below it, along with your soap, towels, wastebasket. You might also not have a 3-compartment sink, maybe a 2-compartment or nothing, but say you can sanitize in a different facility that is licensed. Or say you've got the 2-compartment and you are using a finishing pan to sanitize with the hot water. That can be okay with the variance. There may be other situations that you find yourself in, but these are by far the most common. Now this year, our department has a new form to get these reviewed more quickly and hopefully be as consistent as we can. But again, these are really only an option if you have a justifiable reason that you're unable to meet a code requirement other than financial reasons. All sewage and liquid waste must be disposed of in a sanitary manner. Michelle talked about this earlier, so hopefully that clarifies the majority of folks' questions. So it may include using a private on-site wastewater treatment, or it may be a porta potty, a portable toilet that's part of it. If there isn't a waste drain, like where you're washing your hands over a 5-gallon bucket, you might need to carry that bucket that's got detergent in it, it's got gray water in it, carry it a distance to dispose of it in a sanitary manner. Again, the focus of our agency, our department, is to make sure things are done in a sanitary manner. So we're not evaluating, we're not hydrogeologists. There's a multi-point checklist that we can use to inspect a well, but we're not well inspectors per se. So if you're discharging your cleaning water from your RO systems, more specifically, again, directly to surface water, or if you have wastewater that's being discharged to grade and it's seeping into the groundwater, then you might be required to obtain a permit, or perhaps it's that low impact discharge permit, the general permit from the DNR. Now the Maple Syrup Association and the DNR both host a great fact sheet. That flow chart that I saw earlier, I think it was mentioned, that's really good. That helps me as well. That's going to help our staff hopefully be consistent with you folks. So starting this year, I think DNR is going to be looking more closely at that. And if you haven't already looked into it, you may need to take some oil and grease samples and record some other information. So check out the recording if you missed it. From what Michelle said, when our staff come, if you have that ready, if you are required to have a permit, then show us that you have it. That would be helpful. If you're not required to have it, that may be okay too. Then just show us how you are disposing of your wastewater in a sanitary manner, that it's not causing some kind of nuisance. Another question came in. Are there different facility license requirements for producers who are bulking syrup in barrels compared to bottling? Many cooking facilities are located in more remote areas. It's getting cut off here. I've got to scroll down. It's not auto scrolling. Right, so the facility license requirements, the name of the license is the same. So the license is still, if a license is required, it's going to be called a food processing plant license, most likely. However, Administrative Rule 87, which also covers grading, whether it's food processing plant or not, that covers these solely for concentrating. That's where these alternate requirements are coming in. And that's primarily what these slides are covering. And I've also got the fact sheet reworked, and I didn't quite get the green light yesterday, but I believe I have a finished version to publish within the next week or two, if not Monday, to hopefully focus in and clarify that fact sheet, to rework it, to say, okay, here's what everybody has to follow, kind of a summary checklist. And then here are the perhaps alternate requirements or the nuances that are different for those that are just concentrating. Now, with regard to bulking in barrels compared to bottling, yeah, there's some confusion around the terms bottling. And when we say bottling, what we mean is, essentially what we mean is the retail bottling. When I read the rule, that seems to be the intent of it. And I say it seems to be the intent because it's not written in a very clear way, unfortunately. Different sections are written with different amounts of clarity. But if you focus in on that requirements for facilities used solely, yeah, the intention is there that, yeah, these, if you're concentrating it, you're not necessarily bottling it if you're barreling it. When you're bottling it, we're talking about for retail sale, that final step before the consumer, essentially. As to when the talk and recording will be available online, I would refer to Teresa and the association. I believe there is a OneDrive, or not a Dropbox per se, but there is a folder already set up for some materials, so it might either be there, it might be available through Zoom somehow, I'm not sure, but if you stay attuned to the website and contact Teresa and her team, they will get this recording available. And I believe this one is being recorded as well. So a little bit more about water. Without meeting certain requirements in ATCP 70, the only reuse of condensate that's allowed from thermal concentration is to clean their non-food contact surfaces. So this might be the outside of your evaporator, not the inside where the food contact surfaces are, or it might be your floors and walls. But the requirements for reclaimed water can be complicated. So in this case, you need not test it for turbidity or have an automatic fail-safe diverter. Reuse of water in food processing can save a lot of energy and water resources. There is language in ATCP 70 to do this in a safe manner on food contact surfaces. So the requirements are more stringent if you're going to use it as an ingredient in a food product as well, if you're thinking about doing that. So now, although reuse of condensate gets a lot of space in the rules, if you're reading it overall, by far the most common water-related violation our staff do encounter is a lack of coliform tests on your private well. One of the best ways to keep an inspection rolling smoothly and quickly is to have a folder set aside for inspections with the records that we may ask for, such as your annual test for coliform from your private well, and some other documents to go in this folder. It could be a copy of your license, your recall plan, and any procedures for maintaining hygiene at your facility. So kind of touching a little bit on the food safety plan question. If you have a food safety plan, that's great. Keep it together with the other records that you might expect us to ask for. Switch over to the next clip art guy. Getting some poured off there. Our food contact surfaces. All right, so equipment and utensils, we've got to have them cleaned as often as necessary to remove visible debris and sanitize them after cleaning and before contacting food. That's kind of a general statement. We've got some more specifics in a rule revision, which says that all maple syrup processing, cleaning, and sanitizing must take place at least every 40 days. And that has to do with the growth of the extended run, what we call extended runs. So instead of going 24 hours or less between cleaning and sanitizing, we're going more than 24 hours. And typically for certain products that require special written department approval, and then we had a memo that exempted those, and that memo got incorporated into our rules. So you don't need a special letter necessarily just to go past 24 hours. But there is still a 40-day limit on it. Now, if you stop concentrating and restart again, realize that there's a limited amount of time, possibly 4 to 6 hours to cool your concentrated sap to 41 or below and keep it safe. Also, if you temporarily stop using your equipment and there's enough time to clean and sanitize your surfaces, then you might need to do so for food safety reasons. It really depends. I couldn't tell you in a rule, where it says concentrated maple sap that is a potentially hazardous food and concentrated maple sap that isn't. Because it just, the way it's written is fairly arbitrary. You'd have to do a challenge study really to know, a scientific challenge study to be sure. But that's essentially what our rules say. So again, 41 is a general cutoff for food safety reasons. And if you're not staying in that 4 to 6 hour zone very long, then that's going to be a lot safer for you. And I think you'd get spend too long and you'll get some wild yeasts growing and some bad things happening eventually. Lead was discussed, but lead and copper are not permitted as a food contact surface. Most often these are going to be part of an alloy. So wherever the sap spends most of its time, that's where there's going to be more concern. Also, wherever you've got more surface area. So evaporator pans, preheaters are going to be more problematic to the parts per million of lead and copper in your sap or syrup. Fittings, valves, solder joints, perhaps less so, but not out of the question that those could contribute copper and lead to your product. Filter papers may not be reused, and filtering materials such as socks and presses must be in clean condition before use. If you're using a DE filter, diatomaceous earth, be certain that you're using something that's food grade, so not general purpose like made for swimming pools, for example. Defoaming agents may not contain any major food allergens. Safflower oil is probably the most common defoamer that I see. Typically, it's usually free of any major food allergens. Most commercial oils that you buy in bulk are highly purified and don't contain any food allergen, whether it's soybean oil or peanut oil or what have you. Now, someone making their own peanut oil, that's mostly got allergens in it. But if you made a mistake and used butter for something that isn't labeled with milk, then you may need to relabel your product because milk is one of those 8 major food allergens. You need only look on FDA's website for food recalls, do an online search and see that you've got jams, jellies, and some spreads that butter was used as a defoamer. They didn't list milk as an ingredient. They didn't put butter in as an ingredient, just use it as a defoamer, but you've got no threshold for milk as an allergen. So that product has, that method has led to more than a few recalls on products. Okay, looking for new questions. Keep it going. I think I got about 10 minutes. I'll try to wrap it up. I just got a few more slides left. Not too complicated. Rodents, insects, and other pests, got to keep them out of your facility, of course, but that also means no pets or livestock in the same building either. If you're going to be using pesticides, they must be labeled for use in food facilities, and you must use them according to the label. So for example, any kind of baits like warfarin containing bait, not allowed indoors. Tracking powders, because these spread poisons essentially around after the rodents ingest it. Pesticide sprays are often labeled to be used only after processing when nothing is exposed, and even if you're covering equipment up, you probably got to re-clean everything because the chemicals aerosolize after you spray them. So say it's August or September and you're spraying the fly spray in there. Well, yeah, you probably got to clean up after that for sure. So whatever kind of pesticides you might be keeping, don't store them above or next to any food. Assume that your containers are going to leak or spill eventually, so that however you're going to store them, you store them in a way that can't possibly contaminate the food or harm somebody. Your garbage and refuse must be held in durable, leak-proof, easily cleanable, and pest-resistant containers. Keep them covered with tight-fitting lids. Clean and maintain them so that they don't attract pests. If you're not taking the trash out every day, keep it in a separate sealed room or in a designated area. And if you're burning your garbage or refuse, be sure that you're complying with the state and local laws that apply to you. With regard to personnel standards, there isn't anything extra or additional in ATCP 87, but all personnel at food processing plants are required by federal rule to, and I quote here, receive training in principles of food hygiene and food safety, including the importance of employee health and personal hygiene. So this is something that you need to have a written record of. But before you ask, this presentation isn't a training that meets this requirement. So it could be a training you take online though. It could be something that you use, that's a fact sheet from our department, FDA, CDC, or elsewhere to provide training to your employees. And you're documenting who was trained, what they were trained on, in addition to any training materials that you use, such as the fact sheet. And again, this training requirement comes from Federal Rule 117, 21 CFR 117. That's the Code of Federal Regulations. I'll show you how to get to that in just a little bit. And this was incorporated into our state rule as well. a lot of overlap between those two rules, but that is one thing standing out. A few things you should be doing anyways related to that are maintaining a high degree of personal cleanliness and observing good hygienic practices. So wear clean clothes around your evaporator. Wash your hands every time you enter your building, and wash your hands every time again that you might have contaminated them. So, if you've just cut wood, you have debris on your jacket, shake it off first, put on a different jacket or take it off, and make sure that any contaminants are not making their way into your product. Even if you're going to filter it, it's not okay to be negligent or just say, well, if my product gets contaminated a little bit, that's okay. We'll just filter it back out. If you can reasonably prevent something, then you need to do so. Don't work in the facility if you have a reportable communicable disease. So any symptoms of acute gastrointestinal illness, what some might call a stomach flu, or an open wound. If you do get a scrape or cut on your arm, we're not telling you to wear a Band-Aid, but keep it covered. Also, don't eat, drink, or use tobacco in your concentration room or anywhere else around food that you're processing, storing, or clean materials, clean equipment. I think this is a good place to talk about the COVID-19 and any other infectious agents. We are performing inspections, not as joint inspections at this time. Our staff have been cautiously and in a prioritized way doing field inspections lately. So again, it's basically just a one person, whereas before we would do trainings, audits, joint inspections and things like that. Those are very few and far between. I think maybe some dairy sanitarians are doing where they're able to do that with some distancing, some physical distancing, but our staff will be doing inspections, in some capacity. And they're wearing masks and following CDC guidelines and department directives, essentially, is what they are. So when our rules say do not work in a facility if you have a reportable communicable disease, a lot of this has to do with what's in the restaurant's retail food code, because our food processing plant rules now reference that. It has a lot to do with norovirus. How long has it been since your last symptom? Were you diagnosed or just symptomatic? That's mostly what that language has to do with, but I wouldn't necessarily exclude coronavirus or something else infectious from that. But just understand that, it's been asked repeatedly and restated repeatedly that food and food packaging is not known to spread coronavirus. FDA has stated that. What they haven't stated is that it's impossible. If you get someone saying that, oh, it's always this, or it's never that, or there's no possible way it could. Well, there's a very small possibility of a lot of things, but as far as the primary mode of transmission, I'm not aware of any documented case of it. And they've repeatedly stated that, again, food and food packaging, it's not a known route of transmission for this virus. It's more of a person-to-person thing. A bit more on FDA. FDA may inspect your registered facilities at their discretion. They're going to prioritize their inspections based on food safety risk, just as does DATCP, as our department. And although maple syrup is inherently a low-risk product, FDA may come at any time, so be prepared. Thanks to Christine for going over the facility registration. You do need to register your facility with the FDA and re-register every 2 years since 2003, and this comes from the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. FDA needs to know who's making the food for the United States so that they can prioritize their efforts to keep our food supply safe. So when I say bioterrorism, there have been and will continue to be groups and individuals intending to adulterate our food supply. There's also a federal rule specific to the issue of intentional adulteration of food that applies to the largest of businesses, but keeping your product safe for consumers is basically everyone's responsibility. Everyone needs to do something to keep any sort of malfeasance from happening. Another reminder that registration of your facility is not required if all you're doing is collecting maple sap. FDA classifies this as a farm activity, as does our department. And while there are requirements from FDA for certain farms, registration as a facility is not one of them. The word facility has a very specific meaning at the federal level. So again, when I'm talking about facilities solely for concentrated maple sap, that's not necessarily just applying to the license. That might just be more of your concentration area. You know, maybe it's you're barreling in one building and retail bottling in another. So that bulk barreling, that's going to be, if that's at your concentration facility, then that's what we're talking about there. DATCP may inspect on behalf of FDA as well. Now we call these contract inspections. They're done by a regular staff of inspectors. And if you're on the receiving end of a contract inspection, you may be asked a few extra questions about the size and structure of your business, perhaps some extra details about the distribution of your products. So do expect that to happen. And DATCP may also inspect at their own discretion. So we do try to work with FDA to determine which businesses we have to inspect each year on behalf of FDA, so that we're not inspecting twice within a few months, just to collect information that we missed the first time around. Sometimes there's a lag of information transmission, but that's getting better, I'm told. And I believe with that, we have just a little bit of time left, maybe like 30 seconds or 1 minute for some open Q&A. I'll wait a little bit for the chat. Hopefully I answered some questions that folks had. I wonder if I can share this screen. So what I've got up here is the state legislature website. And there's two different versions that you can look at our rule through. This is 70 and this is 87 here. And if you click this little PDF icon up here in the corner, that's going to get you to this different version here. And only on the PDF version are you going to be able to see things like tables. So I believe there's a grading table down here. That's not going to show up usually, things like that in the other version. But there are some advantages to looking at the other version as well. It's a little easier to link to or to navigate. But if you're going to search it, you got to scroll through the whole thing first to load it. Otherwise, if I'm searching for, say I'm going to search for the word solely, because I want to know what's all this solely business. Holy moly, it's solely. Yeah, that's how you find it. You got to scroll through it all. And lastly, on the federal end of things, you go to ecfr.gov, making sure you have an encrypted connection with HTTPS, and go to Title 21. That is going to be food and drugs. That's where you're going to find the bulk of the federal regulations. I don't necessarily recommend looking at 101 for all the labeling, because you're going to put yourself to sleep. It's about 100 pages long if you print it. But you're going to find the standard of identity for syrup in here. Let's see, which one is it here? At the bottom, 168. There it is. And with that, I'm out of time. Thank you, folks. You can get my contact information. If I can flash it on the slide here. There it is. So now it'll be recorded. Stefan.Boerboom at wi.gov. Thank you.